Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Fixed Wireless Access and the Path to 5G Wireline-Wireless Convergence, sponsored by Juniper Networks. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type them into the Q&A box and submit them to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Toward the end of today's presentation, we will ask for your feedback. A survey will pop open on your screen and will only take 1 minute to complete. Your feedback is extremely helpful. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the Save Audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I would now like to turn the event over to Heavy Reading Senior Analyst, Steve Bell. Steve?
Thank you very much, Morgan, and welcome everybody to this webinar, Fixed Wireless Access and the Path to 5G Wireless Wireline Convergence, sponsored by Juniper. As Morgan said, my name is Steve Bell. I'm Senior Analyst with Heavy Reading, and I'm joined today by the product manager for Juniper, Sandeep Patel, who has a long experience, including 20 years in networking and the mobile industry, and he's a member of Juniper's broadband consumer and 5G converged edge product team. He's a product manager responsible for mobility and convergence solutions. Prior to joining Juniper Networks, Sandeep held various product management, networking, consulting, and engineering roles, including at Cisco, Starent Networks, and Ericsson, 3UK, and Nortel. So he has a broad experience and has bachelor's degrees in electronics and electrical engineering and a master's in telecommunications from University College London. So welcome, Sandeep, to this webinar.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Today, we've got a very mixed agenda. We've got an introduction from myself about this fascinating area, and then Sandeep's going to walk through the market overview and the opportunities, and there will actually be 3 questions, poll questions, not 2. I encourage you to participate in the poll questions because it makes it that much more interactive. And I know Sandeep is keen to sort of tailor his material to the responses that we get to the poll questions. And we will allow probably about anywhere between 45 and 50 minutes at the back end of the presentation for questions. So to reiterate Morgan's request, please submit your questions in the Q&A box and we will get to them towards the end of the presentation. So fixed mobile convergence isn't something that's new, but it is certainly evolving with 5G, and it is probably one of the most exciting spaces because of the fact that it really creates a whole breadth of different user and experiences, but at the same time a whole bunch of new converged operator use cases. Globally, there's 67% of operators that have both fixed and mobile businesses, but that don't yet offer fixed or mobile convergence bundles, with Asia, Middle East, and Africa lagging behind the others. The 5G standards have been evolving over the last 3 years, and in the process of creating the 5G standards through 3GPP and working in harmony with the Broadband Forum, components and changes have been brought together in the landscape, and we have a standardized approach to the concept. And this is going to help service providers leverage the wireline-wireless convergence to provide a differentiated service, including the ability to offer enhanced SLAs along with network simplification and optimization. Nearly 50% of the operators worldwide have both fixed and mobile assets, and this figure was 47% at the end of 2017, so it's actually increasing. Operators that have launched commercial 5G fixed wireless are typically rolling out coverage gradually as they focus on providing a consistent and reliable quality for this new type of service. They're also still working out how best to price 5G wireless bundles, both the service and the hardware, and also the customer premise equipment. And looking at how differentiation may be based on speed or data allowances. The fragmented nature of the spectrum bands used across the world for 5G, including the sub-gigahertz and in the 3.3 to 3.8, and in the millimeter wave in the US around 28 gigahertz and 39 gigahertz, is requiring different developments by region and different country-specific CPEs. And this could, to a degree, inhibit the potential economics of scaling 5G wireline and wireless broadband. But on the other hand, the geographical area that's being addressed, I think offers opportunities that would otherwise be unavailable and supports a sort of a much better bandwidth. So, typically this is going to be an urban approach to a degree, rural and suburban, but that's more limited, obviously, because of sort of range and also bandwidth. But it does overcome the obstacles of the issue with cable and fiber. Operators are going to have to weigh the cost and the opportunity of deploying 5G fixed wireless against extending or upgrading their current or fixed broadband offerings. My colleagues at Ovum have done a study that identifies the different levels of converged capability across the globe in the different regions, and it's included in this presentation. The future of FMC is going to be a blended world. There are 5 benefits that come out of this fixed mobile convergence bundle. Obviously, reduced churn through improved customer loyalty, lower marketing costs, potentially higher ARPU, and a single touch point for customers and upselling opportunities. And it's the upselling opportunities, I think, that is attracting a large number of players to look at being able to participate in this market without sort of where they weren't able to before. And content, and particularly video and augmented reality, will drive this strong growth in 5G bundled services. The enhanced capacity and the available bandwidth means that 5G is in a much better place to address the requirements of households and businesses than 4G LTE ever was. And 5G infrastructure will help to improve the network navigating and switching capabilities as it blends LTE and new RAN and fixed access networks in a blended network. So with that, we'll have our first poll question. And as an audience, we'd be interested to see where you see the fixed wireless access adding significant value. And if you can sort of select all that you think apply, whether that's residential broadband, IoT, private 5G and LTE networks, or ad hoc and temporary connectivity. And while we wait for the audience response, Sandeep, welcome. If you can sort of join me, what are you anticipating to be the response to this question?
I think, from our perspective, so good morning, Steve, or good afternoon, depending on time zone, or good evening. I think from my perspective, I would like to see, or I'd expect to see a broad spread here in terms of the results. There's been a lot of focus on the residential market initially in terms of some of the early announcements, but really, what I believe you'll see is actually longer term, the fixed wireless access and the convergence are really just enablers to opening up some of these other markets. So IoT, private networks, and temporary connectivity, I think, are probably the ones that are going to be longer served, whereas the residential broadband market, whilst it's there, it's a use case for residential, but it's really an enabler for some of these other enterprise segments longer term.
Yeah, certainly private networks is a very hot topic at this point in time. So it's likely that that's going to be the one of the areas. So residential broadband, 80%, IoT, 28%, private networks, 44%, and ad hoc temporary connectivity, 26%. So not a big surprise for you then.
Yeah, I think, like I said, based on the announcements, this is really what we see or what we'd expect. And as you said, longer term, it's the lower three categories, and out of those, you can, as you said, private networks is definitely a hot topic and an area of a lot of interest, as well as a large potential revenue opportunity as well for service providers and enterprises.
Right. Well, I'll let you educate the audience on the fixed wireless convergence.
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve. So I guess good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As Steve said, my name is Sandy Patel, part of the product management team in Juniper. And today I wanted to spend a bit of time discussing fixed wireless access and also how that is, evolves into the 5G wireline wireless convergence activities that are being standardized at the moment. In terms of the agenda, as Steve mentioned, we'll start off with fixed wireless access and look at some of the market overview, some of the examples in terms of customer announcements, etc., that have been made. Look at some of the opportunities with fixed wireless access, and then we'll stop for another poll question and then switch gears a little bit to look towards more about 5G convergence, so the part how networks evolve and the standards are evolving to provide a wireless wireline converged core, and then really look at some of the other services that you can build on top, like intelligent routing, hybrid access, and then finally, really just in summary, in terms of the Juniper multi-access user plane, which can be used to support many of these services today. So with that, I'll start off with with an initial slide. Everybody likes very, very large numbers here, and there's a very large number there. In terms of $1,307 billion here in terms of revenue, and this is more in terms of segments here. So you can see here there's a large opportunity with energy, utilities, manufacturing, healthcare, media, entertainment, etc. One thing I'd like to highlight here is you don't necessarily see connectivity being mentioned here in terms of fixed wireless access or wireline wireless convergence. And really the reason for that is that we see the market in terms of FWA and convergence as providing you with an enabler to open up access to some of these other market segments and opportunities. And so whilst FWA is very much a use case for the residential market, when you even start to think about business and enterprise, it's very much just it's part of the overall connectivity solution, and be able to provide enhanced connectivity and resilient and redundant connectivity. And so we can see this, if we look here from a slightly different perspective, in terms of how these segments split up. We've tried to align these with enterprise, government, and consumer. So in the consumer, you do see FWA as a use case, but in terms of the enterprise and government, you really should think of fixed wireless access and convergence as that key piece in your toolkit that you can use to enable opportunities and enable these customers and segments to move forwards with enhanced connectivity. And what we'll do is through the session, we'll talk about some of these opportunities, specifically from the point of use cases and understanding how some of these use cases can leverage this enhanced connectivity, and what that really brings to these segments. Obviously there's been a lot of talk about 5G in terms of being able to provide massive bandwidth, very low latency, a lot of scale, and all of those elements, combined together to provide that very important connectivity layer, which some of these use cases are built on top of. So with that, let's move on and have a look at some of the market overview and some announcements that have been made. So the first one here, at the top, 5G fixed wireless access market. This is a global number, and you can see by the end of this year, revenue is expected to be around $370 million this year, growing up to $46 billion by 2026. Now, this is quite important because early on when 5G was being discussed, fixed wireless access actually was something that was seen very much as a USA-only focus area initially. But obviously you can see from here, this is a global business, and it touches a lot of different applications. And it's not a small market. $46 billion is a sizable market here in terms of growth. And you can see starting at 370 this year and growing to 46 billion, there is a growth curve here. It's going to be quite steep. So exciting times for fixed wireless access. Let's look at a different way of quantifying the benefits, or should I say the market, really, of fixed wireless access. So another report here by IGR back in February. So there's around 45 million households in the US market. Now, the key part here is households. This doesn't include any of the enterprise or government connectivity that would be required. So you can really start to see the size of this market growing. It's not just 45 million connections. It's actually a considerable more. And interestingly enough, as part of the U.S. market, further analysis was done, and we get to see that in terms of addressing that market, 26.2 million households could be addressed via millimeter wave. So that's the 26, 28 gigs and above frequency ranges, which provide the highest amount of throughput. But obviously, this is really to be used in dense areas because cell coverage is limited compared to some of the lower frequencies, and you have some challenges around propagation. But really, this is where the focus is with fixed wireless access is really the millimeter wave and the opportunity that spectrum brings to us. And then if you consider that, you can consider that the millimeter wave will be used in hotspots and very dense regions, but typically in terms of broad coverage, you're more looking at mid-band spectrum, so 3.4, 3.5, 3.6 gigahertz in that area. And so you still get the speed, but you now start to get increased coverage as well at that point. And so 70 million households. So this, you could think of this really in terms of maybe suburban areas or more wider areas. Moving on. So one of the other things that we've noticed in the market is that there's been several announcements of fixed wireless access. But as you would expect, the focus when 5G was launched, everybody is looking to get that latest announcement out about the latest smartphone, getting your flagship handset with 5G enabled out there. That's really the market capture points. But over time, what we've seen, and in fact, this leads me to the third point, Qualcomm's announced that 33 OEMs now are developing 5G access equipment. And this is quite significant because this now starts to show how the market's now maturing and actually embracing fixed wireless access. So there's a lot of people now developing a lot of equipment. Initially there was some requirements around installation, home installation, but now we're also seeing self-installation the kits being available, and so this should really start to drive the market and ramp up towards that $46 billion that we talked about. So let's just touch on a few, and I've just picked some examples here of different service provider announcements. So Verizon's been one of the first who's been driving this. Launched their FWA service in MWC last year, actually, in 4 markets using the proprietary 5G TF standard. And this announcement, you may be wondering as you read it, it says. Remains at 1 gigabit and 300 megabits. This announcement is actually much more recent. It's actually for the Chicago market, and this is with the 5G NR. So this is the standardized 5G specifications that Verizon's now launching new markets with, and the speeds are up to a gig peak, and potentially 300 megabits per second is the average speed that a user sees. So very fast indeed. Moving across to the likes of AT&T, When AT&T talked about 5G, they mentioned they had these 3 focus areas, that there are 3 pillars for 5G that they wanted to focus on. Mobile 5G, which you'd expect, fixed wireless access being the second, and edge computing being the third. And so you can start to see a pattern here now that, fixed is very much becoming, an opportunity for a new revenue stream for several service providers. We move outside the U.S. market, and start looking at some others. Telefonica mentioned some 5G trials earlier this year where they'd be looking, a lot around the IoT market, so drones and connected cars, so autonomous vehicles, fixed wireless access, and even healthcare. And if we look at Orange, the announcement here is that their focus, the announcement about Orange Romania, I believe, it was more to do with how fixed wireless access is the second use case that they're looking into to address moving forwards. And then, finally, some more customer examples. TIM, sees 5G kicking off as fixed wireless access, and this is specifically for TIM Brazil, and Vodafone. Vodafone's launched its 5G GigaCube, which is the home, the home residential gateway that's used, and so it's added that in as part of its fixed wireless access portfolio. Now, something that's interesting here, and I'll refer to it specifically around TIM's announcement, but this really applies to everybody, is, Tim mentions here 5G is kicking off with fixed wireless access. It actually is a use case that lends itself to a network build-out scenario. So as service providers start to build out their networks, obviously coverage is patchy, but as you start to build 5G areas, you could offer fixed wireless access in those areas as you start to build out your network to provide seamless mobility in the future. And so this gives the service providers an opportunity to actually start to get some revenue back in for all that investment of the billions of dollars they're investing to build out their radio network and core networks by actually offering fixed wireless access in the areas as they start to launch 5G services. Okay, so we just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the opportunities. So now that we've talked about a bit about the market and seen some of the announcements and customer interest, what are the opportunities with fixed wireless access? Isn't it just connectivity, or isn't it just broadband, or is there really more to it than that? So if we think of the urban market, urban broadband leveraging 5G makes a lot of sense. We talked about millimeter wave earlier and mid-band spectrum, but especially millimeter wave in the urban area, it's densely populated. So even with a small cell coverage capability, you have a lot of customers that you can reach within that smaller cell, and so putting up millimeter wave in city locations, in urban locations, it makes a lot of sense. You have a lot of customers that can connect quite quickly. So from that perspective, urban broadband with 5G, is definitely one of the first use cases, especially because that's the first area where a lot of operators are probably going to start to launch or build out their 5G networks, typically starting in some of the key cities and then spreading out further. Now, as part of that, what else can fixed wireless access offer? Well, apart from just broadband, you can actually offer dual access services, and this starts to play not just for residential customers, but also for business customers. So being able to provide equipment that can connect both wireline and wireless access at the same time, it gives you a more redundant network or a more resilient service that you can offer to your customers. Home customers would appreciate that, but especially on the business side, we can definitely see that businesses, some businesses do demand very stringent SLAs around their connectivity infrastructure, and so by being able to provide a dual access service, you can actually have service providers offer a more redundant or improved enhanced SLAs, and obviously that's an opportunity to monetize that as well. That's obviously the key part of it. Something else which builds on top of the dual access service, which is what I'm calling here is walkout working. Now, you may be wondering what that actually means. So walkout working is very much, the scenario where a customer can where a customer, let's say, phones up a service provider and says, I'd like you to connect my house here with broadband, and the service provider says, we can send out an engineer in a week's time and we'll get you all set up. Now, that's fine, but a week is a long time, especially if you're a home worker or if it's a business, then, time is money here. So think of the other scenario. You pick up the phone, you call your service provider, and you say, I'd like to have service, and they say, we can either ship out a router to you overnight, or you can pick one up at our local store, and all you need to do is go home, register it, and turn it on, and you'll get wireless connectivity immediately. We'll still send the engineer out, and they'll still come out a week later and do the installation for you, at which point you'll have both wireline and wireless access, but you'll actually get connectivity immediately. So you can see here this offers an opportunity for service differentiation. And so it's really just building on that dual access capability, and it's something, obviously that convergence is, a hot topic and something that obviously we're going to talk about in the second half of this session. But it really starts to show you that there are opportunities there just by providing these services to different customers. If we stretch out the range a bit, start to look at suburban areas, what are some of the other use cases? So let's consider the temporary and nomadic scenarios. Now, temporary access or nomadic access could be offered to, seasonal demand. So as an example, you may need to provide additional capacity for an event or an event that's taking place. Another example, think of a ski resort, for instance. You need capacity and connectivity, during ski season, but otherwise nobody's really there. Do you need to provide, or, does it make sense to provide a wired connection all the time, whereas you could provide that opportunity much more cost effectively with a wireless solution? Another one more on the residential side. Typically when you move into a city or an apartment, there is an agreed provider or a set of providers that you can use. Now, imagine a customer signs up with a provider A, and then 6 months later or a year later needs to move to another city or another location, and that same provider doesn't provide cable there because that area is covered by a different provider. What do you do in that scenario? Typically the best rates are given to customers who sign up for a year or two at a time, and so you're really stuck at this point because you're going to be left out of pocket. But imagine if you could simply, pick up your fixed wireless access router, so your, 5G home, your 5G gigacube, or whatever the service may be, and you can actually just move locations, turn it on, and you get internet connectivity immediately. You're not waiting for somebody to come and do that connectivity, but you're also not tied down to a single service provider. So really, from a service provider perspective, this provides a lot of stickiness, that if you can get customers to adopt and embrace this service, they take it with them wherever they go. So essentially, customer for life, or at least for a long time. Now, moving on to perhaps the rural areas. So rural broadband. Now, I mentioned this as 4G, and the reason for that is really about the coverage capability. 4G today works at lower frequencies, so has a much better coverage area. Now, moving forwards, in rural areas, you obviously have a less dense and less populated areas, and so you have a large cell size, but you also have less customers, within that single cell itself. And so from that perspective, those customers would actually get quite a reasonable level of service based on the fact that, there aren't that many of them there, and obviously, 4G does have limitations in terms of speed. Now, in the future, this would be definitely an opportunity, perhaps where the low-band spectrum and maybe even mid-band may come in and take over 4G longer term. Another opportunity is around remote IoT. Now, some of the use cases that we're starting to see here that are really starting to grow is things like, agriculture, smart agriculture. Imagine you've got a farmer with, tens of acres, hundreds of acres of land, and he's got different crops growing in different areas. Basically, with sensors that are planted in different areas, that farmer can see, soil, the quality of the soil in terms of, how much water content there is, nutrients, etc. And this really helps them to optimize, the farming side, harvest crops when needed, etc. Now, another one is autonomous vehicles. Imagine oil, gas fields, etc., where you have a driver who's driving supplies from point A to point B, either it could be machinery or tools or supplies. And some of these are in rough terrain areas. But with the advent of autonomous vehicles, this is something that somebody could actually control remotely, from the office, or even still think about it that he or she could be doing their job in their pajamas by driving a vehicle from one side of the gas field to the other. So it does start to change. It's not just about connectivity and business optimization. It also starts to provide a lifestyle change as well. So just wanted to touch a little bit on here. This study was done by GSMA around comparing fixed wireless access costs and fiber. And obviously this is a very broad scenario, but what you really do see here is that it's roughly a 50% reduction in cost in terms of deploying fixed wireless access versus fiber. And as would be expected, it's the last mile cost. It's digging up the roads and laying down that connectivity to the home, which costs the most. It's obviously getting that connectivity out there, but also then having the engineer go out there and actually connect, do the connections to the home or businesses as needed. So I'll just summarize a little bit here in terms of some of the opportunities or products that we have in Juniper that support fixed wireless access. We have two solutions today. One is based around the mobile CUP solution, whereby we provide a user plane that can support fixed wireless access. Or alternatively, we also have a solution which is built around our BNG. So, if you have the Juniper BNG deployed today, it's simply a software upgrade, and you can provide fixed wireless access that will terminate on the BNG as well. And so obviously the CUP solution very aligned with mobile, BNG solution very much based around the wireline core that you have today. So with that, I think it's going to be time for another poll question. But really, what I wanted to emphasize and conclude on in terms of FWA, it's really the evolution and the enabler here. And what you're going to see is that FWA in itself is its own use case. But as we continue through this session, you'll start to see how you can combine FWA with wireline, and this was the path to convergence, and how that opens up even more opportunities, and revenue dollars. So I guess over to Steve.
Yep, absolutely. So our next poll question is, what do you see as the drivers for convergence? And again, if you can select all that you believe apply, core network consolidation, business systems, the OSS and DSS consolidation, operational simplification, revenue from new service offers, and improved user experience. And I'm sure that you're grabbing a glass of water, Sandeep, and just trying to refresh your mouth. But it's interesting. It was sort of identified to me recently that one of the scenarios you were playing out is the whole concept of sort of expanding the consumer and earning from fixed wireless broadband opportunities early on, so that you're getting payback on some of the network investment. And that was phrased as a sort of, getting the consumers to fund the network so that then you can go on to some of the more interesting use cases that you were talking about in terms of sort of autonomous vehicles. Campus autonomous vehicles would be another one, I guess, and as well as the farming and other IoT elements. Have you come across that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, so we do see interest, and one of the reasons why we feel, and some of the discussions we've had, we've noticed that fixed wireless access is growing. Is the 5G network is, whilst I'll say, some people call it revolutionary, from a core network perspective, it's more evolutionary, but it does take a different skill set to manage and operate, and so by offering fixed wireless access in these hotspots and as you're building out your network, it actually also, not does it provide a revenue stream, but it's also providing an opportunity for the service providers to essentially see how 5G is performing, how they can make changes and optimize their network and prepare it for mobility, because when mobility comes along, it actually brings a completely new level of complexity to sit on top of the fixed use case. And so what we're seeing is that it's not just about revenue, but it's also about being able to understand and upskill people and get everybody prepared for what 5G can really bring.
Yeah, it's interesting that this comment had been passed I was at a conference recently, but it was about the fact that it's not technical issues that sort of undo the implementation, it's the skill levels and the new skills that need to be acquired. And it applies to this as well as a couple of other areas in terms of cloudification and so forth. So let's see what the results are.
Great.
Interesting. Operational simplification is the lead one, followed by core network consolidation.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think, like I mentioned, from a user experience, seamless connectivity is something that's going to be expected in the future, longer term. Whether you're connected wireline or wirelessly shouldn't really matter. So I think from that perspective, that's maybe why that's perhaps a little lower, because it's maybe an expected outcome. But it's interesting to see, like you said, the operational simplification is driving this, and followed closely by core network consolidation, as well as potentially new service offers.
And it's also interesting. I mean, the point that you were making about mobility, as mobility comes along and onto the 5G network, then the user experience in terms of being seamless between fixed, mobile, indoor, outdoor is going to be one of the key parameters for selection on a network.
Yep, no, definitely.
Okay, I'll let you get on with the rest of the presentation.
Great, thank you. So let's perhaps switch gears here towards discussing a bit more about wireline wireless convergence. And as I said, the reason why I wanted to start with fixed was it provides a nice evolutionary path into the convergence market as a whole. And so I think it was important to spend some time talking about FWA, and now seeing how with convergence, we can actually expand out that use case bucket, but also start to look at even more opportunities that convergence brings. And some of them, we'll see echo back to the previous poll question about the benefits of convergence. So, what's really driving, convergence today? So I won't go into too much detail. I appreciate, some people may be looking at this thinking, wow, we're going to start doing network architecture diagrams. But I just really wanted to show, how the standards are evolving and what's driving convergence. So we start off here on the left-hand side with LTE. Over time, obviously in Release 14, we had CUPS that was defined, and then Release 15 brought along 5G, the initial 5G release, and support for 5G NSA, where you can have obviously higher speeds leveraging the 5G NR radio, but still connected to your 4G core. And this is, you can think of this as one of the flavors of option 3, 3A, 3X, which a lot of the service providers are planning to take, because it provides them with this seamless path by adding radio and filling up spots with 5G coverage, but still leveraging the same core. And then obviously, it gives you an opportunity to evolve your core in parallel as well moving forwards. Now, obviously on the wireless side, this is driven, very much by 3GPP standards. Now, we in terms of convergence, obviously, if we look at wireline, you've really got the broadband forum, as Steve mentioned in the introduction, that's driving the evolution on the wireline side of the network as well. And so you have, the first box here is your traditional BNG, very simplified network architecture, connected to AAA policy, DHCP, and the BNG and the wireline, the wireline architecture is going through an evolution as well. So something that the Broadband Forum is working on is BNG CUPS. So just like you had the CUPS and separation of the control and user plane on the gateways, you have a similar activity going on here with the BNG being split into a control plane and a user plane element. And what's most interesting is that obviously in release 14, the CUPS interface, the interface between the controller and user plane, PFCP, was defined, and that is used, and it's the same interface that is actually going to be used for BNG CUPS as well. So this SCI, the service creation, point. Basically, this is the same interface, same protocol that's going to be used for both scenarios here, and so you can start to see some commonality, between the wireline and wireless networks as they continue to move closer to convergence. And then finally, you get to the converged core, and so this is here, very simplified 5G network core. It's not shown in the service bus architecture in this diagram because I wanted to keep commonality with what was going on in the 4G architecture. But as you can see here, that the converged core really now starts to take both wireline traffic and wireless traffic. And so the BNG here is evolving into a new function called the access gateway function. And you can think of the access gateway function as interfacing the wireline network on one side and essentially the mobile network or the 5G core on the other side. So now what you'll actually start to see is that all your traffic, be it wireline or wireless, will all pass through that 5G core through the user plane function, and so that now starts to bring new dynamics in from a session level, from a throughput level, but it also starts to bring challenges as well as how you can address this huge amount of throughput that you're going to have to handle coming in from the wireline side of the business. Now, the AGF here is, I've shown it in a CUPS model with a controller and user plane. That is part of the standards efforts of BBF, but initially, you'll expect to see an AGF, which is an integrated model, so a single box, but with the future plan that it will become a CUPS-based model. And the interface hasn't been defined, but it has been agreed by BBF that it will be PFCP-based as well. And so this converged core, you can now really start to think of as multi-access, driven by 3GPP and BBF going forwards. So now that we've looked a little bit about, what a converged core looks like, I wanted to spend a little bit of time here in terms of the opportunities and drivers for wireline wireless convergence. And you'll start to see this, this echoes maybe some of the poll questions, and so that's why we were interested to see what the poll questions would come back with based on some of the things here. So we really see three segments or three areas in terms of benefits. Monetization, obviously you've got to be able to make money. Simplification, how can you simplify potentially your network and processes, and optimization, around being able to optimize your network and do, additional resource sharing. So I'll start off with, optimization here. Now think of this as integrating functions and some of the systems and processes. So on the network side, when 3GPP designed the 5G network, it was designed as a multi-access network from day one. The intention always was that you would be able to support different access types, be it Wi-Fi, be it wireline or wireless. And so from that perspective, you'll start to see a single core, which is being able to handle these different types of traffic. Which is obviously a big shift from today, where typically you have a wireline core and a wireless core, and they're operated independently and by different teams, and they have their different back-end systems, etc. And that leads me to really the second point here, is being able to consolidate around the OSS and BSS infrastructure and some of those platforms that these systems sit on today. There's really a big opportunity, not just to optimize and have a single core network, but also to optimize and really make some significant savings on the OSS and BSS infrastructure by having that now as a single system rather than individual systems that you need to maintain independently. One of the other things that's important is the single subscriber policy and service profile. So single source of truth, two systems, two networks, you have two different databases, how do you keep them in sync? With Convergence, you now have a single database, where your subscribers define, you can define all their wireline and wireless subscriber profiles and policies, And so this really starts to help a bit in terms of the processes that I mentioned, in terms of customer services. Now, if you call up, the single customer service team can answer calls, whether it's wireline access or wireless access. It actually doesn't matter. These teams now are really access agnostic in a sense. From the service delivery and accounting perspective, having these systems together, you can have one bill which simplifies things for a customer. A customer can now purchase both sets of access at the same time, and they're bundled together, rather than having separate bills and separate contracts with different providers. And I mentioned this earlier about fixed wireless access giving an opportunity for people to upskill and develop those skill sets and optimize around the operational processes. And this is very much the case with Convergence here. It simplifies operations. You get end-to-end visibility. It's one team. It's one network. And so really it starts to help essentially the service provider operate more efficiently as well, and provide a consistent set of policies and service options, to their customers. Another important point here is in the 5G core, you have this application function which allows potentially third parties to develop solutions which require intelligence or can leverage intelligence and information from the 5G core and then provide value-added services on top. And so this is this one API we talk about here, where you can have a single API call and get all the information about the subscriber, rather than potentially querying different databases and different networks and trying to somehow combine that data together into some sort of intelligent form that can be consumed by third parties. So definitely some simple options there. And then finally, it is always about the money. So, what does this mean in terms of monetization? So we talked about the enhanced redundancy, having fixed wireless and wireline together. But by combining the two together into a single system, you can obviously offer an increased redundancy, resiliency options. I mentioned slicing here in terms of you could have a converged slice for enterprises, a converged slice for consumers as well, and so this architecture fits very much into the concept of slicing and being able to allocate resources and isolate services to different with different SLAs for different types of users. Other capabilities, bonded access, being able to leverage the bandwidth of wireline and wireless at the same time to handle large amounts of data, and low latency. So this is something which is inherent in 5G. But ultimately, we're seeing this as also a solution that you can leverage, in Convergence. And I'll touch on specifically around some of these in the next few slides. Some of the other pieces very quickly, service offers and user experience. So being able to create services very quickly, so service velocity, service bundling, and seamless access. Like I said, to be honest, longer term, whether your access type shouldn't really actually be of concern to an end user. They should just be able to consume the different services. And then finally, customer attachment and retention. You'll be able to provide service differentiation, stickiness. A customer that obviously signs up to multiple services is more likely to stay with you versus a customer who has one service, which is quite easy then to, he or she can switch that out to another service provider. So, as I said, I wanted to touch a bit more in terms of, what you can do. So we talked about some of the opportunities and the reasons why you'd want to do Convergence. But, on the next slide, we're back to network diagrams again. You can see I do like them. And really here, I just wanted to highlight a bit more about hybrid access, what it is, what enables it, and then how you can drive some of the services using some of the new capabilities being defined in Release 16 specifications, in the 3GPP standards. So here, in terms of connectivity, you have the 5G RG. So the 5G RG really, you can think of this as a residential gateway with a SIM card inserted inside it. And here at this point, the orange lines reflect the wireline connectivity. So as I mentioned, you have connectivity via the AGF, and that then transports the data into the 5G core itself. If we add now wireless access, so this is the scenario that you'd expect to see in terms of hybrid access. You get connectivity over the air via the G node B, or it could be even an E node B, depending on coverage. And this is obviously providing, your typical access through the mobile core or the mobile side. Something that allows us to combine, or enables convergence is the concept of this multi-access PDU. And so the multi-access PDU essentially allows you to have a single session within the user plane function, but the user plane function understands that there are multiple paths to the user, to the end user, be that wireline, wireless, or both at the same time. And so this is something which is quite key that I'd like to emphasize, is that it's really about having that single anchor point for your session that allows this capability and provides an opportunity to add value-add services. And this is where the ATSSS function comes in, a little bit of a mouthful. Sometimes you may see this referenced as AT3SF, which is the access traffic steering, switching, and splitting function. So if we move to the next slide, hopefully I can demonstrate this a little bit better here. I apologize for the funny graphics. Obviously, that didn't quite work out how I expected. But the ATSS function resides on the user plane function, and it also resides in the 5G RG. And the policies are pushed down from the policy and charging function down towards the ATSS functions in both the user equipment as well as the UPF, and this allows for steering traffic and switching traffic both on the uplink and downlink directions. So if we simplify, or we focus and we look at a simplified view of the network here, you can see that the ATSS function sits in the UPF here, and I've left it out here on the 5G RG, but just obviously there is a counterpart of that on the 5G RG. There are different opportunities here, or different capabilities, should I say. So you can steer at a low layer, which is really at the IP layer, or you can even have a steering function which supports MPTCP. And then there are some handsets now that are starting to leverage MPTCP capability, and then that's one of the use cases there. You can also look at leveraging MPTCP for bonding, whereby you would use both access channels for traffic as well. And then in terms of the steering mode, I think this is probably best shown with a diagram. So if we look at the simplified diagram here, in terms of steering, so we have that yellow traffic flow that's coming in, and based on the policy rules, the 5G RG steers that over the wireline network. And you could have a separate flow which could come in, and that could be, steered across the wireless network. And then, so at this point you can have active standby based on call types or priority, or even latency based. And so there is this performance measurement function that's been defined where you can leverage that, and it measures the round trip times across both access technologies. And so if you have traffic which is latency sensitive, you can, the ATSS can actually steer that either over the wireline or the wireless based on, the policy information. And then finally, you've got one more here, which is the, the bonded scenario or the load balance scenario, where you can have traffic coming in, and it can be, directed both across the air as well as over the wire. So hopefully that gave you a bit of an overview, and these are obviously very high level slides and topics. Each one of these could be probably a webinar in itself. But I really just wanted to introduce these concepts to you in terms of fixed wireless access, what the opportunities are, and then what convergence brings and how convergence adds a layer on top, and really opens up the doors to enterprises and segments. As I said, it's really about providing an access agnostic capability on which you can drive services and enterprise use cases above. So finally, on this final slide, I just wanted to spend a very brief amount of time on our Juniper multi-access user plane function. And as you can see here, the lower layer green here, we support the BNG user plane, the SAE gateway user plane, the UPF for 5G core, and the AGF user plane in the future as well. And really, this is about being able to combine and co-host these services in a most efficient manner. As I mentioned before, PFCP has been used for both the mobile, and it's being used for the wireline in terms of separating the control and user plane. And so this provides an opportunity for multi-vendor support. And so within Juniper, we have worked with several mobile partners in terms of different SAE gateway control planes working with the Juniper user plane. And from a BNG and an AGF perspective, we will obviously be providing our own control plane as an option within this solution as well. So with that, I guess it's time to hand back to Steve.
Hi. Yes. Well, last question for the audience. When do you plan to implement 5G wireless wireline convergence? 1 to 2 years, end of 2021, 2 to 4 years, beyond 4 years, or undecided? And while we are waiting for them to come back, it'd be sort of good to have a look at a couple of questions. Since we're sort of getting short of time. And I guess it's typical to sort of say, well, why would you invest in fixed wireless access? I mean, I think you've been laying out the case, but why would you do it as opposed to fiber?
So I guess there's I can use a scenario based on a customer discussion that we're having, where a customer actually has copper deployed today, and it's really a case of going into that market and essentially digging up all that copper and replacing it with fiber is not actually practical from a revenue or return on investment perspective. But you do have regulatory requirements. A lot of our service providers do have to provide minimal levels of service. And so by providing fixed wireless access, it actually gives an opportunity to still provide increased data speeds, but at a more cost-efficient way rather than, fiber. Another reason very quickly could be around, as I mentioned, if we have a new community being built or a new town being built, you can make provisions for fixed connectivity and laying it down. But where you've got cities and towns that are already built, the civil engineering costs sometimes outweigh the benefits for perhaps the initial amount of subscribers. And so sometimes it's easier where you have in an existing area, you can add fixed wireless access as an overlay, and then use convergence to provide that bonded access and increased bandwidth that the users will expect.
Well, let's see if it's convinced anybody to change their plans. Well, 43% are still undecided. 30% are going to do it by the end of 2021, and 23% in 2 to 4 years. Does the number surprise you?
I'm interested in terms of the undecided. That's something that's a little bit of a surprise. The other one that I'm actually surprised at is the 1 to 2 years. So, obviously standardization for convergence is still being completed in release 16, so not available until next year. And so it's interesting that 30% of the listeners here expect to have convergence by the end of 2021, because that shows quite an aggressive timescale. So that's quite exciting to see from a vendor perspective.
Well, and maybe depending upon the audience, but you've got sort of, if there's wireline broadband providers, I mean, maybe it's the issue of when does a 5G converged core help them reach new customers.
You're definitely right there. It is perhaps a large step to undertake, but I think what you'll find is that it does open doors for additional, subscriber revenue, be that residential or enterprise. And moving forward, it's really the enterprise that everybody talks about with 5G that's really going to do the spending. So if we take the example you mentioned, about the private networks and campus connectivity, you can really start to see where convergence would make a big impact. And so today, if you've got wireline-only operators, they can look to partner with a wireless provider to provide that, wide area connectivity that's going to be needed in the future to service, IoT, but even campus-wide connectivity, as well as in-building, where you can leverage Wi-Fi connectivity and have on-prem user planes so you can do seamless handovers between, essentially your let's say your campus-wide versus your in-building networks.
Just going to push the survey to the audience, but while we've got a few minutes left, because we're almost at the hour, one of the other questions was how could, I'm following on from what you were just saying, but how can you offer enterprise quality services over 5G?
So I think, private LTE or private 5G is something that's really a focus area here. And there's a mixture. You can either leverage the macro network and the macro, but I think private is where the focus is going to be, where you have an on-prem user plane, you have your own coverage, and that's really needed because you may find that you have requirements around data requirements in terms of being able to keep your data on-prem and not provide it or pass it over the public network. And so I think what you'll find is that 5G opens up that door because it provides you with the capacity and the speed, but it also enables the infrastructure around it to be able to offer convergence or fixed wireless access across a campus, which is dedicated to a business or an enterprise versus connecting to, let's say, the macro or the public network.
Well, I know you're enthusiastic, and you've covered a huge amount of ground and given a huge amount of information to the audience. So thank you, Sandeep, for a great webinar, a great presentation, very fact-filled and great diagrams of the architecture. So clearly passionate, and obviously you can talk for most of those subjects for quite some time. But to the audience, thank you for attending. We hope you found that interesting. If you can fill out the survey, it helps us to ensure that we deliver quality content for you and access feedback for us. And for everybody, Sandeep included, I wish you a very pleasant rest of the day wherever you are and at whatever time zone you're in.
Thank you very much.